This is Torah Nation TV, and we are speaking with the head of Machon Shilo, Rabbi David Bar-Chayim. Shalom Harav Bar-Chayim.
Shalom.
Many Jews are accustomed to engage in forms of mourning during the period of Sefirat HaOmer. When did this custom originate?
The earliest mention of this customary mourning period between Pesach and Shavuot indicates that this custom was already in place, at least in the latter period of the Geonim. In other words, we're talking about the 9th or 10th centuries. Prior to that time, it's unclear whether this custom was known, but it is certainly the case that in medieval times, that is to say from the 12th century onwards, we have many sources from the time of the Rishonim, the medieval Torah sages around the world, who mention this fairly widespread practice, although not universal. It should be mentioned. It was not practiced in all Jewish communities in all parts of the world, but apparently in most parts of the Jewish world, this was the custom. Some form of mourning was in place during this period.
What reason is given for the customs of mourning during this period?
If we look at the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, in Tractate Yevamot 62b, it relates there as follows. It says that Rabbi Akiva, the famous Tana, the famous Torah sage of the 2nd century, had many, many thousands of students. The number given in the text before us, the normal printed versions of the Talmud, speaks of 24,000 students, which is, if you think about it, a rather fantastic number. And it says that these students all died during the period between Pesach and up to 15 days prior to Shavuot, because they did not treat each other with respect. So it says in the Talmud, in the versions before us. There are a couple of difficulties with this text. Number one, the number 24,000, as I mentioned, seems rather incredible. And second of all, it seems rather unusual that because of such a practice, that is to say, because of not treating each other with proper respect, that they all should have died, and all should have died at almost the same time. Furthermore, we could add another question, and that is it in fact likely that the students of Rabbi Akiva behaved in such a manner towards each other? It's interesting to note that we have what is called Igeret Rav Sharira Gaon, that is to say, a letter written by one of the last of the great heads of the Torah academies, the Rashi Yeshiva in Bavel, Rav Shira Gaon, who lived in the 10th century. And he writes, quoting this text from the Talmud, that the students of Rabbi Akiva died in what he terms Shemada. This word, Shemada, in Aramaic, in Hebrew, Shemad, has only one meaning, and that is religious persecution. In other words, a government policy to eradicate and uproot Judaism that was enforced at that time. As a result, the students of Rabbi Akiva died, or rather, it seems one should say, were killed. This is a very different version of the story, of the events. It doesn't really square with the text that we have before us. And yet, it seems more than likely that this version of the Talmudic text is the original version. First of all, because Rav Sharira Gaon is known as one of the most authoritative of the Geonim, of the heads of the Torah academies in Bavel during that period. And second of all, he was obviously a very early authority, much closer to the sources than we are, and if he quotes the Talmud in that fashion, it's more than likely that this is the correct version. Now we have to ask ourselves, that being the case, what in fact was the historical background to this chain of events? We know that in the year 132, according to the Christian calendar, the famous Bar-Kokhba revolt against the Roman Empire, Roman rule in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, broke out and lasted for 3 years till the year 135. It is also known, based on explicit statements in the Jerusalem Talmud and other sources that originate in Eretz Yisrael, that Rabbi Akiva supported this revolt, which was led by Bar Kokhba, whose real name was Shimon ben Kusiba. Rabbi Akiva supported this revolt, and in fact was of the view, so it is reported explicitly in the Talmud Yerushalmi and Tractate Taniot in the 4th chapter, that this leader, Ben Kusba, or Bar Kokhba, was in fact going to prove to be the Mashiach, the Messiah. Because we must recall that at first, for quite a long period of time, for a couple of years, the revolt was very successful. It caught the Romans off guard, and the Romans had to retreat from the country for a period of time and regroup and call up many extra legions from far-flung corners of the empire, as far away as Britain. And for a period of at least a year and a half, perhaps 2 years, Shimon ben Kusba, also known as Bar Kokhba, he was apparently so called by Rabbi Akiva, who saw him as a candidate for being the Mashiach, the Messiah. For a period of about 1.5 to 2 years, he was the de facto ruler of the land of Israel, and he was known, and so he is called on coins that were minted at that time by him and his followers. He is known as Nasi Israel, the king or the leader of the Jewish people. So we know there was such a revolt. This is a well-known historical fact that no one doubts. The question is, what caused this revolt? After all, the Romans had destroyed the temple, the Bet Mikdash, in around the year 70, many years before, some decades before. And this was the first major revolt from that time. The historical sources tell us as follows. Two explicit Roman historians tell us. One of them is called Spartianus, and he relates that the revolt of Bar Kokhba was set off by a Roman injunction making circumcision, Brit Milah, illegal. And he is quite emphatic that this took place before the revolt, and he in fact explicitly states that this was the reason for the revolt. Another historical source, another Roman historian from that time, Dio Cassius, writes that the cause of the revolt was the decision by the Emperor Hadrian to rebuild Jerusalem, not as a Jewish city, but as a new Roman colony, which would be called Ilia Capitolina. And he had in fact already begun to implement this plan. Part of this plan was to build a great temple on Har HaBayit, on the Temple Mount, to Jupiter, the Roman god Jupiter. And there is in fact no contradiction between these two sources. First of all, both these sources claim that the reason they each specify, the one the ban on circumcision, and the other the plan which was beginning to be put into effect to rebuild the city of Jerusalem in a totally different and foreign way, which would exclude the Jews from Jerusalem and from the temple area, of course, etc., etc. These reasons are given as having been the cause of the revolt. It's very likely that both these reasons played a part. It seems more likely, based on a number of sources, that there was already a lot of unrest amongst the Jewish populace of the land of Israel at that time. It seems that initially Hadrian had indicated that he would rebuild the temple, and the Jews were looking forward to that prospect. But when they understood that he imagined it would be some kind of ecumenical, multi-religious, multinational temple where all kinds of gods and all kinds of people could worship in their own way, the Jews, of course, refused to countenance such an idea. And Hadrian apparently was taken aback by this and dropped the plan for rebuilding the temple in any way, shape or form, other than the idea of creating a purely Roman temple to Jupiter on the site of the Jewish temple, which of course inflamed the Jews of Eretz Yisrael, and in fact beyond the borders of Eretz Yisrael as well. On top of this, there was the law which stated that circumcision should be banned. This was in fact not necessarily a law that was initially conceived of in order to punish the Jews or to attack Judaism. There was a general rule in place in the Roman Empire. This is a well-known fact that made any act of castration or any other form of mutilation of the genitalia a criminal offense. What Hadrian apparently did was to include circumcision within the purview of this law. And this, of course, was something the Jews found intolerable. This was an attack on essentially daily Jewish existence, one of the very fundamentals of Judaism, and this apparently was the final straw which led to the revolt. At any rate, the fact of the matter is there was a revolt, and the Rabbi Akiva did support this revolt, as did probably many, if not most, of the Jews and most of the sages, the Chachamim in Eretz Yisrael at that time. And there's no doubt that the version of events that Rav Shira Gaon reports, namely that the students of Rabbi Akiva died in a shmada, which is precisely what we just described, a religious persecution. In other words, the Jews who revolted against the Romans at that time saw themselves fighting a war for religious and of course national as well, but first and foremost religious freedom, to the freedom to perform circumcision and all other acts as required, all other miswot required by the Torah. The students of Rabbi Akiva without a doubt took place in the fighting and the revolt as soldiers in the army of Bar Kokhba. This was not a time when Torah students could stay at home claiming that they were protecting the nation by studying. If you wanted to revolt against the Romans, which was a fairly incredible decision to make in the first place, taking into account the tremendous, overwhelming power and force and might of the Roman Empire, if you wanted to take them on militarily, then you needed every single fighting man that you could get. So the students of Rabbi Akiva without a doubt took place in the armed revolt against the Romans, and when it's reported in the Talmud that they all died at that period, that's entirely 100% true. But they did not die because they did not respect one another. They died because they were fighting a war for religious and national freedom. If a person asks, then why does the Talmud suggest this other very parva, very neutral and somewhat calm suggestion, that is to say, as opposed to the violent truth, the historical truth? The answer would be simply that in later generations, the Jews, particularly in places like Babylonia, did not know the historical facts. They did have a tradition that the students of Rabbi Akiva died at that time, but they didn't actually know precisely what the course of events was and what triggered what, etc. So According to Rav Shira Gaon, we have the original version of the text, apparently, which simply speaks about a shmada. The word shmada, without a doubt, can only refer to a politically motivated government policy of religious persecution, which is exactly what the Jews felt they were dealing with, and for this reason they revolted. Whereas the more familiar text in the printed versions of the Talmud is an attempt not to cover up anything, but simply to offer some explanation for something that seemed inexplicable or without any rhyme or reason. And this is something that we find in a number of cases and circumstances where the true historical facts were not known. Other reasons were offered, usually of a moralistic nature, in order to try and evoke some kind of moral teaching from an historic event.
Are the mourning practices during this period obligatory?
The short answer is yes and no, which of course sounds confusing, so I'll try and explain. There is no absolute law requiring us to mourn during this period. It is not a halacha, it is a minhag, it is a custom. It also needs to be stated that this was not a universal custom. There were parts of the Jewish world that did not have any such mourning period during the period of Sefirat HaOmer. The Radbaz, for example, in a tshuva and halachic responsum, writes that he was familiar with certain communities where there was no such custom at all. I can tell you for a fact that, having spoken to many Jews from Teiman who remember what they heard from their fathers and grandfathers, they tell me quite plainly that in Teiman, in Yemen, 2 or 3 generations ago, this custom was not widely practiced. That's number one. Number two, seeing that a majority of the Jewish people have been mourning or following certain forms of mourning during this period, and have been doing so for a very long time, there is a good reason to continue and to observe these mourning practices, and yet they have to be kept within certain halachic bounds. By that I mean that it is unreasonable, for example, for a person who normally shaves regularly, every day or every few days, not to do so Erev Shabbat, before Shabbat. This is a requirement according to halakha to shave, without going into the question of how exactly it is mutar, permissible halachically to shave, but assuming that one is shaving in a way that is permissible, it is incorrect not to shave lichvot Shabbat, before the Sabbath. So if one has a custom of not shaving for weeks on end, one is inevitably transgressing this particular halakha, and a minhag should not overturn a halakha. The same is true of Rosh Chodesh, head of the month. The same is true of Hol HaMoed, etc. It is also true that over the generations, some of these practices have been expanded and different things have been added to the list of mourning practices. In the earlier sources we find only 2 things mentioned. One is the custom not to have weddings, not to hold weddings, marriage services during this period. And the other, which is mentioned in many but not all of the early sources, is not to cut one's hair or trim one's beard during this period. Again, we have to keep in mind that in those days people did not shave their beards as many people do nowadays. Trimming a beard is something that was done only occasionally, every few weeks or months, and therefore it was not in any way an issue not to trim one's beard every Erev Shabbat, every Friday. So that reality has changed. So keeping these things in mind, and also keeping in mind another fact, that is that Hazal did not find it necessary or even advisable to decree a period of mourning for the events of the revolt of Bar Kokhba, which is an interesting point in itself. Seeing that we know how calamitous and how disastrous the results, the outcome of this revolt were, according to certain historical Roman sources, nearly 1,000 towns and villages in Eretz Yisrael were destroyed. Hundreds of thousands were killed and hundreds of thousands were sold into slavery. We're talking about one of the greatest calamities in Jewish history. And yet, Chazal did not institute a special period of mourning for these events. It seems that Chazal's intention was not to have very severe mourning practices in place for an extended period of the year, so that many weeks or months of the year would be taken up with such mourning practices. Apparently, their intention was that national mourning for all such events should be concentrated in the period of Tisha B'Av and the days leading up to Tisha B'Av, in the month of Av. So keeping all these things in mind, it is proper to maintain these customs, but we do not have to add and expand on them beyond what is to be found in the original sources describing this minhag. So therefore the practice of not getting married during this period for a number of weeks, the practice of not getting a haircut or trimming one's beard for a number of weeks, this is correct as long as it does not interfere with the halachic duty of honoring the Shabbat and Rosh Chodesh and similar days. And for this very same reason, by the way, it is correct and proper to celebrate a day like Yom Tekumat Yisrael, Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel Independence Day, even though it falls during the period of Sefirat HaOmer, because that is a halachic requirement, as we have explained in an earlier interview and in some articles, as opposed to this, which is a custom and not an absolute halakha, not an absolute law.
Thank you, Bar-Chayim.